generic universal role-playing system, or GURPS, published by Steve Jackson Games, has a reputation for complexity. Which is interesting, as the essential mechanics can be summed up in a booklet small enough to fit in your wallet, presumably to annoy those with pocket constitutions and Bibles. To play, you'll need a copy of the rules, 3 6-sided dice, preferably for each player, but 3 for the table also works, and a pencil and character sheet. Now you'll want a copy of the first GURPS Basic Set book to give you the full allotment of character creation options. Other than that, and I want you to look at me, this is important, leave the rest of the content to the GM. I know I was glib before, but GURPS books are written in the sort of dry tone lawyers write contracts, trying to preempt ambiguity and without narrative flow. There's a lot in there. Most of it is optional, and it's easy to go cross-eyed if you stroll through casually. Instead, download GURPS Lite 4th Edition. It's a free PDF, it's 32 pages long, and it's what I'm building this lecture off of. It still has the same writing problems as the rest of the product line, but it's less content to process. Again, the basic set is nice to have, but reserve that for character building and obscure roles. And actually, I'd recommend you read GURPS Lite irregardless of if you intend to play or not. There's some good game structure and floor advice in here. Okay, now the central mechanic of GURPS. Roll 3d6. If your roll is equal to or less than the target number, you succeed. Roll over and you fail. A roll of 3 or 4 usually succeeds. 17 or 18 usually fails. Everything else just elaborates on that, which I guess technically is true for every system, with possible changes to what dice you use and whether you want high or low results. But this is the generic universal role-playing system, and so it's designed to be as fundamental as possible. However, there's still the matter of vocabulary, when to roll, and how to interpret the results. Though, a quick note, GURPS uses slightly different terms than most systems, such as abbreviating dice as just the letter D following the number of dice rolled, saying 3D instead of 3d6. For accuracy, I'll endeavor to use the same terms as the text, but excuse me if I accidentally say base stats instead of basic attributes. Every character has 4 basic attributes: strength for physical power and toughness, so it determines throwing and receiving blows, dexterity for agility, coordination, fine motor skills, and movement speed, intelligence for creativity, knowledge, memory, perception, and will, and health for energy and vitality. Again, general role-playing stuff. These stats will have a score between about 6 and 15. In absence of a relevant skill, this is the number you're trying to roll under. For most rolls, you consult your character sheet to see if you have the relevant skill and how many levels you have in it. That number is referred to as your base skill, and is the default target number for the success roll. Often, however, circumstances will modify the number in some way, like using a tool to help accomplish the task or some obstacle making it more difficult. Depending on what it is, you add or subtract a modifier to the base skill. The resulting number is the effective skill, the target number you have to roll at or under. You also have a chance to get a critical success or a critical failure, which means you either get an extra benefit or flair on top of succeeding in your attempt, or receive an additional detriment or embarrassment on top of failing. In all cases, rolling a 3 or 4 is a critical success. If the effective skill is 15 or higher, 5 is also a critical success. Effective skill of 16 or higher adds 6, where it tops out. Rolls of 7 or higher, while they can be successful, never critically succeed. Meanwhile, a roll of 18 is always a critical failure. If you have an effective skill of 15 or less, 17 becomes a critical failure. Then you stop worrying about it until you get to effective skill 6. At which point, if you overshoot your effective skill by 10 or more, roll 16 or higher if you have an effective skill of 6, you get a critical failure. For an example of success rolls, let's say you want to climb a tree to grab an apple. It's a strong, knobbly tree with sufficient handholds for someone who knows what they're doing. Your character has 10 levels in climbing. If there's nothing to add or subtract, the base skill of 10 is also the effective skill of 10. If rolling 3d6 results in a 9, which is less than 10, the character successfully climbs up the tree for her snack. Now, let's add in a rainstorm. Assuming you need this apple immediately, you will have to contend with a much more slick climbing surface, and thus get a -3 penalty. take the base skill of 10, subtract 3 to get effective skill 7, keeping the previous roll to save on the art budget, and 9 is more than 7, so the character is not able to climb up the tree. You could use a step ladder to boost you closer to the target apple, or a rope to assist with the physical climb. Either one will give you a bonus, which is added to the base skill to grant a higher effective skill, thus moving the failure point further along the bell curve. I'll explain how to find the base skill more fully during character creation. For now, just know bonuses and penalties are added to the target number, not the die roll, which is different from most games. In some situations, it's also important to know the margin of success or failure, which is the difference between effective skill and the number rolled. In the tree climbing example, the margin of success was 1. Sometimes the GM will just use that to inform how he narrates the results, saying you lose your footing a couple times along the way. Sometimes you need to know the margin of success or failure because you're racing someone up the tree for the last apple. Whoever has the biggest margin of success, or smallest margin of failure, gets to the apple first. Sometimes there's a tie, which means, well, a tie. Then it's up to you and your fellow players to decide how to resolve that. So a notable difference with GURPS than, say, D&D 5th edition is because the target number is written on the character sheet, the player will immediately know if their roll succeeded without having to report their result to the GM who knows the target number. So, in cases where the result would be unknown to the player or the character, the GM rolls for them instead. That should be everything you need to know to play the game. Just remember, 3d6, roll low, and you'll learn the finer points real quick. Next time, creating a character. For GURPS character creation, you will want a copy of the first basic set book, Characters, though GURPS Lite will still work, a copy of the character sheet, a pencil, and probably a calculator to keep a running tally as you go. It's a point-buy system. You'll want a quick way to track your points. Point-buy is what it sounds like. You start with an amount of points determined by the game master based on how powerful they wish the characters to be, typically starting with 100 to 200 points for exceptional heroes. You, the player, then use these points to increase attributes or to purchase skills and advantages. Conversely, by decreasing attributes or purchasing disadvantages, you receive more points to spend on other things. This is where the calculator helps. Although, I guess you could use scrap paper. All characters start with a 10 in every basic attribute, the average ability for an average human. Considering the target is to roll under this number, and the range of outcomes from 3d6s is between 3 and 18, inclusive, that actually puts your odds of success at about 50-50 when you factor in the bell curve. So keep that in mind when I tell you that increasing strength or health costs 10 points per level, where dexterity and intelligence cost 20 points for each level. It'll make you better at that particular attribute, and improve how many levels you can purchase in various skills, but there are diminishing returns. You can also decrease from 10 in an attribute and gain the appropriate amount of points to spend elsewhere. While in theory, you could raise or lower your attributes as far as you can afford, you should stay within the 6 to 15 range. Any lower, and your character rapidly ceases to function. Any higher, and you start reaching the levels of deity. I could elaborate from personal experience, but shouldn't. Trust me, you can find whatever you're trying to represent in the realm of advantages and disadvantages, where taking clinical depression will give you 15 more points to spend, and you can add and remove limbs to your contentment. There's many options, so just nudge your basic attributes to represent broad talents and weaknesses, and define your character in the next few sections. Once you have finalized your basic attributes, we move on to secondary characteristics. Your hit points, which determines how much damage you take before you collapse, is equal to your strength score, but can be increased or decreased at a cost of 2 character points per HP level. Will, your ability to withstand psychological stress and supernatural attacks, is equal to your intelligence, and modified at a cost of 5 points per level. Perception, the notice things stat, is also equal to your intelligence, and costs 5 character points to modify. Fatigue points, which you can spend to exert extra effort or cast magic, is equal to your health score, and modified for 3 character points per FP. Basic speed, which determines your combat turn order, among other things, is health plus dexterity divided by 4, with no rounding to break ties, and an additional 0.25 basic speed can be purchased or sold for 5 character points. Finally, basic move, which is how far you can go in a combat turn, is your basic speed with the decimals cut off. So a basic speed of 5.25 translates to moving 5 yards in a turn. You can add additional yards of movement for 5 character points. Dodge is basic move plus 3. I don't know if you can purchase better dodge, as GURPS Lite doesn't actually cover any purchase costs for that, and the GURPS Wiki doesn't mention dodge at all. So much math. Although I do have one piece of advice before we move on. Write out a paragraph describing who you want your character to be, then find advantages and disadvantages that fit your pre-written characteristics. I understand the appeal of grabbing a plate, walking the full length of the serving area, and loading up everything that looks tasty in the buffet. But when you get back to your table to eat, you'll find yourself overwhelmed and struggling to consume it all, and the others at the table have their own plates to contend with. You can go back for more later, especially since the GM rewarding you with more points is how character growth happens in this game. GURPS is a grocery store, not a catered meal. The next 3 steps are advantages, followed by disadvantages, then skills. Though you may want to do those in reverse order, so you can first dictate what your character can do, and maybe get some point debt to balance out, then determine what sorts of obstacles and flaws they have to contend with, ending with innate traits that assist with the previous 2. Advantages and disadvantages are straightforward. There's a list of advantages with descriptions of the positive narrative and mechanical effects they have for your character, with how many points it costs to gain that advantage. Disadvantages are the same, except with a negative, but fun, effect, and denoted with a negative point cost, which means you receive that many points to spend elsewhere. There's also quirks, which is a free-form single-point disadvantage for things like dislikes green vegetables or prefers to wear purple. Things with nominal effect that nevertheless adds a little life to the character. As always, read the book for more depth and guidance. Skills might require you to use that calculator. Look, sometimes math happens to good people. Just be glad it's open note. Like with advantages and disadvantages, there's pages and pages of available options for skills. Unlike advantages and disadvantages, the point cost varies depending on the relative difficulty of the skill and how good you want to be at the skill in comparison to the corresponding basic attribute. GURPS Lite presents skills rated easy, average, and hard, while the basic set also has very hard skills. So find the skill, decide how many levels below, at, or above the basic attribute listed you wanted, then find the cost on this table. One further wrinkle is that, once you go beyond the contents of GURPS Lite, some skills come with prerequisites. Either other skills you need levels in, or certain advantages you need to possess. This is most prominent with magic. In GURPS, spells are a type of skill, and to learn more advanced spells, you need to know certain lesser spells first. If I may extend myself from instruction to game master advice, outside of magic, consider compiling a standardized list of skills for your campaign. This will both prevent overwhelming your players with options, and also allow you to streamline asking for checks away from players attempting to volunteer what skills they have, which might apply to this situation. Now you may be wondering, can I attempt a skill I'm not trained in? The answer is yes. Mostly. Below the skill name in the listing, you'll find an entry for default level. This is what you roll if you're untrained in the skill. However, some skills, like computer programming, have no default level, as they're complex to the point where you have to have some idea what you're doing in order to attempt it. If there's no default level, you cannot attempt that skill untrained. Once all that's written down, you can move on to equipment. The GM will give you an amount of starting wealth, possibly modified by certain advantages or disadvantages, with which you can, once again, consult pages of options and purchase items. Luckily for me, weapons and armor is a topic for the combat lecture, so we can call an end there. So, a quick summary. The GM assigns the point total. Strength and health costs 10 points to increase. Dexterity and intelligence cost 20 points to increase. Decreasing will give you extra points to spend. Then you use points to purchase advantages, disadvantages, and skills, as limited by relevant factors. Equipment is purchased with starting wealth. It's a lot, but that's what sets and zeros are for. That concludes character creation. Next time, combat. Combat in TRPGs is typically handled in an odd, abstract minigame where combatants take it in turns to move around and attack each other during an intense, life-threatening situation. It's just the most efficient way to make the chaos of fighting an orderly event. GURPS, being obsessed with simulating reality as closely as possible, insists that rounds take 1 second apiece, and every action in the round is to be considered as happening at the same time. This is, of course, a horrible and confusing headache to bestow upon GMs and players alike, so I promise not to report you to Steve Jackson Games if you abstract the system a little bit. It can be even more complex than what I'm about to explain, since I'm working off the Combat Light rules found in the first GURPS basic set book. You can get real fiddly with just these rules, so maybe hold back on the full rules from the second book for when it really matters. Again, GURPS is filled with options, not edicts. GURPS uses a grid of 1-inch hexagons for the combat map, upon which the GM draws a physical representation of the battlefield, wherein each hexagon represents an area of 1 yard, or approximately 1 meter if you prefer the superior metric system. Once the battle area is portrayed to the GM's liking, place whatever you're using to represent combatants, whether it's miniature figurines, paper standees, loose buttons and candies, or, if you're me, wooden peg dolls, onto the battle map where your character is at the start of combat. With the material components sorted out, the next step is to determine the turn sequence, the initiative order. Compare the basic speed, which you determined during character creation, of the combatants. Ties are broken by who has the highest dexterity, then by just rolling for it. Turn sequence remains the same throughout combat. Highest basic speed goes first, then second highest, down the line until everyone's had a turn, then back to the top. On your turn, you may choose from a list of maneuvers. Things like attack, move and attack, concentrating on a mental task of some sort. I really don't want to list them all. They're in the book, so read the descriptions, get help from others at the table, and be open to learning from misinterpretation. Rule of thumb is you generally get to do 1 thing on your turn, though attacking and moving can count as half a thing depending on the situation. You can also sacrifice rolling to defend yourself on an enemy's turn to do just a little more with your attack or to move a little further. The move action is easy. You can move your character up to a number of yards equal to your move score, which is basic speed with the decimals cut off, possibly modified by advantages or other factors. Remember, each hexagon is 1 yard, so you can move however many hexagons as you have move score, or if you'd like, less. Alternatively, you can move and attack. Your character gets their full movement, as already described, but during or after they move, the combatant may attack with a penalty. For a melee attack, it's a flat -4 to skill, and for a ranged attack, it's either a -2 or the weapon's bulk rating, whichever is worse. For an attack maneuver, pretending our fighter didn't just move, you make a typical success roll based off your character's skill with the weapon they're using, applying the relevant modifiers. Melee attacks are just that. Ranged attacks factor in whether you took a maneuver to aim, the size of the target, and other fiddly bits. Largely, it's weapon skill, then apply modifiers. I'm just indicating there's more factors to be aware of if you're firing a gun and bow. If you roll equal to or less than your effective skill, then your opponent rolls to defend, rolling against their effective defense stat, and if they succeed, the target manages to block, dodge, or parry the blow as relevant. However, if the attacker got a critical success on their roll, the target doesn't get a chance to defend. If you succeed in landing the attack, roll damage as dictated by your weapon statistics. Presuming the hit lands, we can finally move on to damage. First, take however many dice your weapon, or natural attack ability, says to roll with modifiers, roll the dice, then subtract the target's damage resistance, listed with whatever armor they're wearing, spell they have cast, or advantage they possess. Sometimes your weapon has an armor divisor which modifies the target's damage resistance. If, after all that, your damage roll is less than or equal to the target's damage resistance, you fail to penetrate and cause no damage. Why are you like this, GURPS? You are so good until it's time to punch faces. Okay, to summarize, this is the one time you want to roll high. Your weapon or attack dictates the number of dice to roll. You apply the relevant modifiers, then try to get above the target's damage resistance. If you tie or fall below, you fail. It's the standard ability check done from the other end. Other maneuvers you may choose include Concentrate, where you maintain focus on a spell or other mental task. Ready, where you prepare a weapon or item for use, perform a physical action like opening a door or picking a lock, or do something else not covered by other maneuvers. You can also elect to do nothing, because doing something would put you in a bad spot. You can wait, which is do nothing unless a specified event occurs, in which case you do a thing. You can feint, all-out attack, or all-out defend, which are the sorts of things that, if you're doing them, you might as well just consult the book directly. Everyone got that? Good. Let's forget about maneuvers then. By listing options, the writers risk making the players feel limited. So here's how to actually think about your turn. Each turn, you can do one thing. Attack, move, do any action, or not do any action. As long as you can imagine doing it in about a second, you can do it. If you want to do something complicated, then spread steps out over several turns. Again, one turn is one thing. A thing and a half if you're walking and chewing bubblegum. Combat is often where the true nature of a game system can be assessed, as it's the element that requires the most explicit rules to maintain fairness and cohesion. GURPS, as you can tell, is pretty granular. What with its 1 second per turn structure and requiring rolls from all parties involved in an attack, it is a fair way to handle the question of whether the target's able to block in a meaningful way. But it does mean GURPS has long, intricate encounters. Maybe that's exactly what you want? If, like me, you're not a fan of overly involved combat, rumor has it there exists alternate combat rules in the additional materials. However, I don't own that PDF, and anyways, it falls outside the minimal viable product rule for these lessons. Perhaps I'll come back to cover it another time if there's truly a demand. As with every game, try your best, figure it out with your fellow players, and if it's not working, it's okay to change things. The rules are mostly just guidelines. Until next time, may your dice make things interesting.